Welcome back, friends. I'm Annie Rind, and you're listening to 1001 Business Problems Solved with Microsoft Teams, where we slow things down just enough to talk about how these tools actually work once the marketing fades and real business life sets in. Today, I want to start with a familiar idea because it gives us a simple handle for everything else we're about to talk about. Most of you have heard of the 80-20 rule. The short version is this. In many systems, about 20% of the effort creates 80% of the results, while the other 80% of the effort only creates about 20% of the value. It's not math you can balance precisely. It's a pattern you start to notice once you've lived inside real businesses long enough. A small number of decisions drive most outcomes. A small number of problems create most of the pain. A small number of conversations change the direction of everything. If you want to really move the needle, the 20% is key. That's the meat of your day. And that lens turns out to be incredibly useful for understanding Copilot. Because here's the counterintuitive truth. Copilot is already very good at the 20% of work that creates 80% of the value, and not nearly as good at the 80% of busy work that only creates 20% of the value. Most people expect the opposite, and that mismatch in expectations is where a lot of frustration with Copilot comes from. When people first open Copilot, they tend to give it what feels like easy work. Create a document. Format this nicely. Turn these notes into something polished. Make this look professional. And sometimes it does an acceptable job. Other times, not so much. The output can be unimpressive or maybe even downright horrible. The tone isn't quite right, the structure wanders, the formatting doesn't match what you imagined, or it's so bad you wonder why you even bother with Copilot. That's usually when someone decides Copilot is overhyped, unreliable, or not ready for real work. But here's the thing, those tasks feel simple to us because we've been doing them for decades, but they're actually very precise, rule-driven, and expectation-heavy. They live in the 80% category, the necessary busy work that keeps things moving but rarely changes the trajectory of anything. Now contrast that with what happens when you aim Copilot at the other side of the 80-20 equation. Ask Copilot to help you think through a messy people issue where emotions, incentives, history, and power dynamics are all tangled together. Ask it to help you clarify a strategic decision where none of the options are perfect and every path has risk. Ask it to help you pressure test an idea, name trade-offs, or find language that genuinely matches your intent instead of just sounding nice. That's when Copilot suddenly feels like a different tool altogether. Because complexity, the real kind, the human and ambiguous kind, is where Copilot shines right now. Today, you don't have to wait until new functionalities come down the pike. You can do this right now. You can use it and abuse it for the 20% of work that creates 80% of the value, and it never gets tired. Helping you see blind spots before they turn into expensive mistakes. Helping you slow down your thinking just enough to choose better words. Helping you explore options you wouldn't have had time to consider on your own. That's not clerical support. That's cognitive leverage. Strategy is a perfect example, as you've noticed in our last several episodes. Real strategy isn't filling out a template or producing a polished document. Strategy is thinking about trade-offs, sequencing, unintended consequences, and what you're implicitly saying no to when you say yes to something else. Copilot doesn't do strategy for you, but it's exceptionally good at helping you work through strategy. It can surface risks, compare approaches, suggest alternate paths, and challenge weak assumptions without ego, fatigue, or defensiveness. Around here, we like to tell Copilot we're about to do a brain dump over several prompts, that we're going to give it a bunch of messy, random thoughts, and that we'd like it to organize and make sense of those thoughts, moving us toward a coherent strategy from our unorganized human-level thinking. It never ceases to amaze me at how it can organize my messy thoughts. The same thing shows up in human situations. If you bring Copilot a simplified version of a people problem such as, write me an email telling someone they messed up, you'll get something generic and forgettable. But if you bring it the complexity, the context, the constraints, the relationships, and what you're trying to preserve as well as fix, it becomes a strong thinking partner. And this pattern holds for communication too. When wording matters, when you're trying to say something clearly, responsibly, and in a way that will actually land, Copilot becomes a collaborator. You can adjust tone, test alternatives, simplify without losing meaning, and iterate at conversational speed. I recently had a long-running Teams conversation with an external collaborator where, over time, the tone started to feel just a little bit off. Nothing was wrong in any obvious or dramatic way, but my gut told me this was the kind of situation where a well-intended response could easily land the wrong way. Rather than reacting quickly, I paused and brought Copilot directly into the chat, asking it to look at the entire 4-month conversation and help me think through the next best step. What I appreciated most was how grounded and specific Copilot's guidance was. It didn't psychoanalyze or assign blame, but instead pointed out several patterns in the conversation that are commonly associated with sheer workload pressure, even pulling a handful of short quotes from the thread that illustrated how that stress can quietly leak into communication. From there, it encouraged me to lead with empathy, to assume positive intent, and to be mindful that the other person might simply be carrying a heavy load. It suggested keeping my request almost embarrassingly small, something that could realistically be knocked out in 5 minutes, and reminded me not to add to anyone's overwhelm while still nudging the project forward in tiny, manageable steps. The wording it helped me craft did exactly that. It moved the work ahead, respected the human on the other side of the screen, and preserved a healthy working relationship. That's exactly the kind of help I want from AI in situations like this. I'd much rather Copilot help me in such complicated situations than to deliver flawless formatting in a Word document. Copilot is really shining at helping us here at County Quest with the 20% work. So when people say, Copilot struggles with the basics, my response is usually, yes, and that's not the part that should excite you anyway. The real danger isn't that Copilot fumbles some formatting. The real danger is missing the fact that it already does something far more valuable. It supports better thinking at the point where decisions are still flexible. Now, there is one caution that matters enough that I want to make it a standing reminder. You'll recall that I covered this in more detail last week, but just to be safe, here it is again. Copilot wants to please you. That's its default posture. It will agree with you, reinforce your direction, and smooth over uncertainty unless you explicitly tell it not to. So, for anything involving real consequence, strategy, leadership, people, or decisions that have downstream impact, you should always change Copilot's role. Don't let it cheerlead. Tell it to be your devil's advocate. Ask it to pressure test your plan. Invite it to poke holes, surface risks, and challenge assumptions before reality does it for you. That single instruction often differentiates shallow usefulness from genuinely high-value insight. And this brings us back to the 80-20 idea where we started. The mistake most organizations make with AI is trying to automate the 80% of work that doesn't create much value, while ignoring the 20% that actually shapes outcomes. But Copilot flips that script. It's already strong where leverage lives, even if it still struggles with some of the surface-level tasks we're used to optimizing. That's not a failure of AI. It's an invitation to use it differently. If you aim Copilot at the kind of thinking that normally requires time, energy, and a good sparring partner, you'll get more value than if you aim it at formatting chores and cosmetic tasks. And over time, the busy work side will improve. That's inevitable. But you don't have to wait for perfection to get the upside. You just have to focus on where the leverage is. Use Copilot where decisions are still soft, where wording still matters, and where clarity isn't obvious yet. That's where the 20% lives, and that's where Copilot already earns its keep. And with that, friends, I'll wrap it up. Remember, Copilot shines at the 20% of work that creates 80% of the results. Don't judge it by the busy work alone, and never let it cheerlead you through high-consequence decisions without a little pressure and pushback along the way. Until next Monday, this is Annie, signing off and reminding you that clarity beats clever every single time.